So to close out this segment on the new normal, this really quotable quote. I said I like quotable quotes. We're in a meeting and Jody Watson made this observation. It's become one of my main quotes to quote to people, which is, through sharing and learning, ensure that where we are going is indeed the right way. Through sharing and learning. So it's not, this comes back to, I'm going to constantly be referring to our top-down, bottom-up approach. Nobody's prescribing things, so basically we all have to, it seems like we all have to agree to move in a certain direction before things begin to happen, and the pressure for change comes from the bottom. And I'll explain a bit more about our legislative philosophy in a moment. So moving on to Water Balance 101. I'm speaking in terms of what we're doing in British Columbia because we are different. We are different from the rest of North America. And the reason we're different comes back to our geography. So a couple years ago, I drove across North America, across through the States with my son on a road trip, and it really hit home how topography, geography shapes your thinking. Because when you get, the rest of the continent, it's flat. I mean, they have some rolling and they may have some little bumps, but it's different, the big river systems. But British Columbia, it's mountainous. You saw that photograph, and it affects your thinking because the situation is different. So we have a strong connection to the natural environment because people still remember the 1950s when streams were teeming with salmon. So we still have that connection. People respond to that. And so we have embraced the whole systems approach. The rest of the country, where urban drainage is a priority, their regulatory drivers are still water quality and flooding. And the engineered approaches typically follow U.S. practice. So that's a fundamental difference in terms of how we approach things. So again, in terms of this bottom-up approach, and really the constant messaging, the constant kind of getting what we're doing into a language that anybody can understand, because the way I've always said to people is the people we ultimately have to reach are those who on Monday nights, because that's our council nights, elected representatives get together, that audience is ultimately the decision maker, because local government controls land use. So it's not about water, it's not about land, it's about how what you do on the land impacts on water. So mimic the water balance to reduce risk. Yeah, you can think of the obvious thing like reducing flooding, but it's more than that. It's the environmental risk, and it's the financial risk of not getting it right. That's what we're being paying the debt for. And improving watershed health. That's one of those hot button phrases for us right now, improving watershed health. And of course, complying with regulatory requirements. So our goal, kind of to reiterate, is different from the rest of the continent because we are primarily a mountainous region, because headwater streams are our predominant feature. So yes, you've got the Fraser River draining half of British Columbia, exiting at Metro Vancouver, but we all live in the tributaries, and so we tend to trash the tributaries because as a young engineer, I was as bad as anybody. You'd say, well, as a percentage of the total watershed, it represents a very small percentage, so there's no impact, is there? Well, of course, what you do then is you proceed to eliminate your prime habitat, which is why in the 90s we had a salmon crisis, where the salmon population literally collapsed, and that was the call to action for us, the salmon crisis. So watershed health is very much about protection of aquatic habitat, but protection of aquatic habitat comes back to drainage and the land development and the erosion of streams. It's an energy question, right? More water running off, more energy, higher velocities, you're blasting out the creeks. But then something happened. And in 1996, in Washington State, Rich Horner and Chris May published their research, which just shook the foundations of conventional stormwater management thinking to its foundation. Because we in British Columbia, we came so close to going down the water quality route based on copycatting what was happening in Eastern Canada and the States. But when Rich Horner and Chris May produced their research, which comes down to the soundbite, which is if you get the hydrology right, the water quality typically follows along. So the science was the trigger for a change in philosophy. Because what their research established was the roadmap. So in terms of, these last 20 years, linking rainfall, the landscape, stream flow, groundwater, and here's a new phrase for you, sustainable service delivery. I'll come back to that at the end of my presentation. It's been a building blocks process. So reduce runoff volume, mimic flow duration, sustain infiltration, integrate performance targets, downscale targets to a site level, and now viewing water balance pathways as infrastructure assets that provide services. So when we went on that cross-Canada workshop tour 2 years ago, the other provinces would say, well, what are your criteria? Because they're all talking like engineers. I'm an engineer, so I can say that. And we said, well, no, we don't have any criteria because we're focusing on the outcome. What's the outcome we want? Because the challenge we're putting out there is, what do we want British Columbia to look like in 50 years? Because if we want to achieve that condition in 50 years, it's the decisions that we make today that will create that future. So the other part of science-based understanding is it becomes clearer over time. So even my own knowledge, has been like this because, you fall into the trap of just kind of doing the same old, and then you start thinking about things differently. So it's a process that you have to go through. So inspired by Horner and May, and they were coming at it from the biophysical point of view, they identified, okay, it's the hydrology, stupid, and that led us in British Columbia to say, okay, we've got to go back one step further. We've got to go back to what changed the hydrology. And that was the point where, when I came here, we were overcoming fear and doubt because my fellow engineers, they thought in terms of flooding and peak flows. And so a key to turning things around was demonstrating the achievability of rainfall capture. And that was the essence of what, we were in the early stages in 2001, it was a year before the guidebook was released, of getting things into a language that people could understand, moving it beyond just the engineers to a broader group. And when we look at our rainfall, an annual typical year in the Metro Vancouver region, the south coast on the Vancouver Island, we get in the order of 170 rainfall days a year. You go inland, it's in the order of 110. And so that's the pattern I began to look at, looking for a universal pattern. And that's why one of the defining moments for me was John Argue. John shared an observation from one of your colleagues. Remember that, John, about no matter what whether it was Darwin or Tasmania, if you looked at the patterns were universal. The volumes might change, but the patterns, the distributions were universal. And that's what we began to look at, saying, okay, we can actually, if 160 out of 170 rainfall days are less than 5 millimeters, we can manage that. Because that represents the bulk of the rainfall. And about that time, what Horner and May were telling us is that it's that critical threshold in terms of impervious area where all of a sudden those innocuous rainfall days were now creating the wear and tear on our channels and habitat. So it was a fundamental shift in thinking from peak flow thinking to, no, we've got to manage the entire spectrum. And I'm probably not telling you anything new, I'm just telling you how we arrived there. So watershed protection starts with an understanding of how water gets to a stream and how long it takes. And this is a fundamental point which we find too few people actually grasp it. So it's part of going back to basics, saying, you have to think in terms of the three pathways: surface runoff, minutes to hours, interflow from days to seasons. And when I was talking to John Argue, what did you tell me, John? He said, interflow is not a word that's in common use in the vocabulary here. Correct, right? He's nodding his head. Yet that's the key. Interflow is the key, as I'll show you in a moment. That's that horizontal layer. And of course, the deep groundwater. So coming out of this slide, guiding principle number 2, maintain the proportion of rainwater entering the stream via each pathway. mimic the water balance. And this graphic here actually became the core branding graphic for stormwater planning, a guidebook for British Columbia, released in 2002. Because of course, we knew that to deal with the environmental issues, we had to manage at the site, we had to manage at the neighborhood scale. But my engineering colleagues in local government would say, but what about when it floods? And so we said, well, different strategies for different parts of the spectrum. Water balance in a West Coast watershed, no doubt if you plug your numbers in, you'll have different numbers. Kind of like when I talked to Bill Till, and he explained to me that your set of numbers in WA are different again from our numbers in terms of the split. So you got to look at what your numbers are. And so understand where the water goes naturally and reproduce those conditions. So you can see from this table here that in terms of the three pathways, that interflow, it's 55%. And that's the pathway through the 50s and 60s and into the 70s that new development was eliminating. Because I don't know what your practices are necessarily here, but our past practices were to develop a piece of land, you come in and you strip the soil. And then you put the turf down on glacial till, and then you water the hell out of it in terms of the summer months. And then you wonder why, there's no sponge left, right? There's no sponge, so that you're absorbing the water when it rains, and you're slowly releasing it in the summer months. So that was a fundamental shift in thinking. If the desired outcome is to limit stream erosion, prevent flooding, and improve water quality, then guiding principle number 5 is replicate the flow duration pattern to mimic the water balance. It's taken this long to get to this point. So our epiphany was about 2007. What's interesting right now, there's only 2 other jurisdictions which are on the same page as British Columbia. Washington State, 2012, they embraced flow duration. California, last year. So we're in communication with those jurisdictions right now in terms of how they're implementing an approach to mimicking the water balance. We all use different language. Like in California, they talk about hydromodification. So there's a word you can Google, and you get all the California experience. And Eric Stein's the name to keep in mind. But that's where we're at in terms of the water balance. And there are landscape architects in the crowd. Where are the landscape architects? Okay, over here. Well, I'm glad you're here because in terms of communicating, the rain garden is the perfect way to communicate what we're trying to do. Remember what I said about how are we going to accommodate our growth in population through redevelopment of a watershed? So, we have limited opportunities. We don't have great expanses of land, but we can build rain gardens. One rain garden does not make a difference. Thousands will. So that journey to a water resilient future starts with a rain garden. And I just want to give you the engineering detail because it does come down to an engineering detail and looking at that design of how you implement the 3 targets. For volume, for release to sustain interflow. And here again, we're thinking in terms of, we have the pipe system. All the roads have the pipe. But all those storm sewer systems discharge into creeks. Well, at least we can manage the flow rate of those creeks to replicate a natural condition with a very controlled release, and providing an area at the bottom of that collection to infiltrate for deep groundwater recharge. So, same engineering detail, just looking at it differently. And it's probably something most people in this room, all engineers, have done. So, coming back then to the landscape architects, a kind of a key ally, and so the one municipality in British Columbia, which really was a pioneer in the rain gardens, their big aha was, we should team a landscape architect up with a civil designer. Because you couldn't expect the civil designer to do the rain garden. So it took the team, so that was more than a decade. So now this year they're celebrating their 10th year of a rain garden program in a fully built out urban area, and it's a commitment to the long term. It doesn't happen overnight.